In a world where rank determines respect and silence can speak louder than words, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody expects. What happens when a casual joke about military hierarchy reveals a truth so profound that even an admiral, a man who commands fleets and decides the fate of nations, falls into stunned silence? This is the story of Sarah Chun, a woman whose ink tells a tale of precision, sacrifice, and secrets that run deeper than the ocean itself. When Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison thought he was making light conversation at a naval reception, he had no idea he was about to uncover one of the military's most closely guarded legends. Some tattoos are just art. Others are earned in blood, carved in memory, and worn as silent testimony to moments when a single shot changed everything. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor as hundreds of naval officers mingled in their dress whites. The annual Navy Achievement Award ceremony had concluded an hour ago, and now the real networking began. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his collar and scanned the room, looking for familiar faces among the sea of gold braids and ribbons. Jake had always been good at reading people. After 12 years in the Navy, he developed an almost supernatural ability to assess someone's rank, experience, and worth within minutes of meeting them. It was a skill that had served him well, helping him navigate the complex hierarchy of military life and advance his career in naval intelligence. Tonight, however, his attention was drawn to someone who didn't quite fit the usual mold. Near the far corner of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a marble column, stood a woman who looked to be in her early 30s. She wore the standard Navy dress blue uniform, but something about her posture immediately caught Jake's eye. While most officers at these events stood with the practiced ease of those comfortable in their positions, she held herself with a different kind of bearing, alert, watchful, as if she were constantly assessing threats and escape routes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and from this distance, Jake couldn't make out her rank insignia clearly. She appeared to be alone, which was unusual for an event like this where networking was everything. Most officers, especially the ambitious ones, will be working the room, shaking hands and making connections. But this woman seemed content to observe from the shadows. Curiosity got the better of him. Jake made his way across the crowded ballroom, weaving between clusters of chatting officers and civilian contractors. As he drew closer, he could see that the woman was nursing a glass of what looked like club soda with lime. Not exactly the drink of choice for most naval officers at a formal reception. "Enjoying the party?" Jake asked as he approached, flashing his most charming smile. "I'm Jake Morrison, Lieutenant Commander. I don't think we've met." The woman turned to look at him, and Jake was struck by her eyes. They were an unusual shade of green, almost emerald, but it wasn't their color that caught his attention. It was their intensity. These were eyes that had seen things, processed information with the kind of rapid assessment that came from training and experience. "Sarah Chun," she replied simply, extending a firm handshake. Her grip was strong, with calluses that spoke of regular firearms training. "Nice to meet you." Jake glanced at her shoulder boards, trying to read her rank in the dim lighting. The insignia seemed to indicate lieutenant, maybe lieutenant junior grade, though he couldn't be entirely certain. Given her apparent age and the confident way she carried herself, he found this puzzling. Most officers her age who possessed her obvious competence would have advanced further by now. "So, Sarah," Jake continued, deciding to probe a little, "what's your specialty? You have the look of someone who's seen some action." He was fishing, trying to place her in the vast machinery of the Navy's organizational structure. Sarah's expression remained neutral, though Jake thought he detected the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I do a bit of this and that," she replied vaguely. "What about you? Intelligence, right? You have that particular way of asking questions." Jake was impressed. Most people didn't pick up on his background so quickly. Guilty as charged. Naval intelligence, currently assigned to the Pacific Fleet. Been doing threat assessment and strategic planning for the past few years. He paused, then decided to push his luck a little. I have to ask, and don't take this the wrong way, but you seem pretty young to be rubbing shoulders with all these senior officers. What's your rank? Just curious about how you ended up at this particular party. The question was meant to be casual, even slightly joking, but Jake noticed an immediate change in Sarah's demeanor. Her posture straightened almost imperceptibly, and those green eyes seemed to sharpen their focus on his face. For a moment, he wondered if he'd crossed a line. My rank, Sarah repeated slowly, as if considering how to answer. That's an interesting question, Jake. What made you assume I'm junior to everyone else here? Before Jake could respond, he noticed that their conversation had begun to attract attention. A small group of officers nearby had stopped their own discussions and were glancing in their direction. Among them, Jake recognized Captain Williams from the Pacific Fleet staff and, even more surprisingly, Rear Admiral Thompson, who rarely attended these social functions. Oh, I didn't mean anything by it, Jake said quickly, suddenly, feeling like he might have made a social blunder. It's just that you look young, and you're not exactly working the room like most of the career climbers here. I figured you might be new to these kinds of events. Sarah set down her glass on a nearby table and turned to face him fully. Jake, let me ask you something. In your experience in intelligence, what's the most important skill for gathering information? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Jake answered automatically. Observation, I suppose. Being able to see what others miss, to read between the lines. Exactly, Sarah nodded. And what's the cardinal rule about assumptions in intelligence work? Jake felt a slight chill of unease. They make you miss what's right in front of you, he replied, quoting from his training manual. Very good, Sarah said, and now there was definitely a smile, though not necessarily a warm one. So tell me, what have you observed about me so far? Jake realized he was being led somewhere, but he couldn't quite see the destination. He took a moment to really look at Sarah, applying the analytical skills he'd been trained to use. The calloused hands suggested extensive firearms training. Her posture indicated someone comfortable with physical confrontation. The way she positioned herself showed tactical awareness of the room's exits and potential threats. The fact that she was alone but completely comfortable suggested confidence born of capability, not arrogance. You're military, obviously, but you're not a typical desk officer, Jake said slowly. Your hands show you spend a lot of time on the range, and your situational awareness is exceptional. You carry yourself like someone who's been in combat situations, but you're too young to have seen much action and less. He trailed off as a possibility began to form in his mind. Unless what? Sarah prompted. Unless you're in a specialized field where age doesn't necessarily correlate with experience, Jake finished. Special operations, maybe? Intelligence field work. Sarah nodded approvingly. Better. You're starting to think instead of just assuming. But you're still missing something important. At that moment, Admiral Thompson began walking in their direction, and Jake noticed something he'd somehow missed before. The other officers weren't just glancing at their conversation. They were watching Sarah specifically, and their expressions weren't curious or dismissive, as might be expected when observing a junior officer chatting with a lieutenant commander. Instead, there was something that looked almost like respect, deference. Admiral Thompson, Sarah said calmly as the older man approached. I didn't expect to see you here tonight. Commander Chun, the Admiral replied with a slight nod, and Jake's world suddenly shifted on its axis. Commander? Not lieutenant junior grade, but full commander, a rank that typically took 15 to 20 years to achieve. I see you've met Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Admiral Thompson continued, glancing at Jake with an expression that seemed to convey both amusement and warning. Jake's one of our sharp young intelligence officers. So, I've gathered, Sarah, Commander Chun replied. He was just asking about my rank. The Admiral's eyebrows rose slightly. Was he now? And what did you tell him? I thought I'd let him figure it out for himself, Sarah said. It seemed like good practice for someone in intelligence. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks as he began to understand just how badly he'd misread the situation. Commander Chun, I apologize if I Sarah held up a hand to stop him. No need to apologize, Jake. It's an understandable mistake. Most people see what they expect to see. She paused, and her next words were spoken with the kind of quiet authority that made it clear she wasn't making conversation. She was making a point. The question is whether you're interested in learning to see what's actually there. Admiral Thompson excused himself, but not before giving Sarah a look that Jake couldn't quite interpret. It seemed to contain elements of respect, concern, and something else, perhaps gratitude. Once they were alone again, Jake found himself in the unfamiliar position of being completely off balance in a social situation. "Commander, I really did misjudge." "You did," Sarah agreed. "But not in the way you think." She picked up her glass again, taking a small sip. "You assumed I was junior because I'm young and because I don't fit your mental template of what a senior officer looks like. Those assumptions kept you from seeing the real indicators of my background and experience." Jake was beginning to feel like he was in a training exercise where he kept failing to identify the correct objective. "What indicators should I have seen?" Sarah's smile returned, and this time it seemed genuinely amused rather than predatory. "Well, for starters, you noted my calloused hands and assumed range time. That's partially correct, but the pattern of calluses suggests something more specific than standard military training. The positioning indicates extensive work with precision instruments requiring fine motor control. Specialized weapons training." Jake guessed. "You could say that." Sarah glanced around the room, ensuring their conversation remained private. "You also noted my situational awareness, which you correctly identified as tactical training. But you missed the fact that I've been unconsciously monitoring not just the exits, but specific individuals in this room. Their positions, their movements, their potential threat levels." Jake followed her gaze and realized she was right. Without seeming to pay attention to the crowd, she had somehow been tracking the movement of key personnel throughout their conversation. "That's not standard military training," Jake said, his respect for her abilities growing. "That's something else entirely." "Now you're starting to understand," Sarah nodded. "But there's one more thing you missed, something that would have told you everything you needed to know about who I am and what I do." Jake looked at her more carefully, trying to spot what he'd overlooked. Her uniform was regulation, her jewelry minimal and appropriate. Her hair was styled correctly, her posture professional. Then he noticed something at the base of her neck, just barely visible above her collar, the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo. "You have ink," he observed. "I do," Sarah confirmed. "And unlike most military tattoos you've probably seen, this one tells a very specific story." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Would you like to see it?" Jake nodded, his curiosity completely overwhelming any concern about propriety. Sarah glanced around once more, then carefully adjusted her collar to reveal more of the tattoo at the base of her throat. What Jake saw made his breath catch. It wasn't the typical military ink. No eagles, anchors, or unit insignias. Instead, etched in precise black lines, was the image of a rifle scope's crosshairs, with a series of small hash marks arranged around the perimeter. At the center, where the crosshairs intersected, was a single small red dot. "Jesus," Jake whispered, finally understanding. "You're a sniper." "Naval Special Warfare," Sarah confirmed quietly, adjusting her collar back to its proper position. 7 years, 3 deployments. The hash marks represent confirmed kills, and the red... She met his eyes steadily. The red, that represents something very specific. Jake's mind was racing, trying to process this information. Naval snipers were among the most elite warriors in the entire military structure. Their training was legendary for its difficulty, and their operational record was classified at levels he'd never had access to, despite his intelligence clearance. "How many?" he asked, then immediately realized it was probably an inappropriate question. "Enough," Sarah replied simply. "But that's not really the point of the tattoo. The point is that everyone who sees it understands exactly what it represents. It's not decorative art, it's a service record. And the red?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "That's a longer story, and probably not appropriate for reception. Let's just say it represents a particular mission that had significant strategic implications. Jake was beginning to understand just how far out of his depth he'd been from the moment he'd walked over to introduce himself. Commander Chen wasn't just a senior officer. She was a legend in a community he'd never even known existed. "I have to ask," Jake said, "why are you telling me this? I mean, I appreciate the education, but this seems like the kind of information that usually stays within certain circles." Sarah considered his question for a moment. "Because you asked an honest question, even if it was based on faulty assumptions. And because you seem like someone who's genuinely interested in learning rather than just trying to advance your own career." She paused. "And frankly, because most of the people in this room already know who I am. You were just the only one brave enough, or naive enough, to ask directly." As if to prove her point, Jake noticed that several other officers had been glancing in their direction throughout their conversation, and their expressions now made perfect sense. They weren't curious about the young woman talking to a lieutenant commander. They were observing a decorated war hero who rarely made public appearances. "So, when I asked about your rank," Jake said slowly, "I was essentially asking a Medal of Honor recipient why they weren't wearing their ribbon to a dinner party." "I don't have a Medal of Honor," Sarah corrected. "But your analogy isn't far off. I have received some recognition for my service, though most of it can't be discussed in public settings." Jake felt a mixture of embarrassment and fascination. He'd spent his career analyzing threats and capabilities, but he completely failed to recognize one of the most lethal individuals in the U.S. Navy standing right in front of him. "Commander Chun," he said formally, "I want you to know that your service is appreciated, even by those of us too ignorant to recognize it immediately." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Jake. That means something coming from someone who's dedicated his career to protecting this country's interests." She finished her drink and set the glass aside. "But I should probably get going. These events aren't really my natural habitat." "Before you go," Jake said quickly, "could I ask you something? Not about your service record or anything classified, but what's it like? Being able to do what you do, I mean." Sarah studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether the question came from genuine curiosity or morbid fascination. "It's like any other job, in some ways," she said finally. "You train until the skills become automatic. You follow orders. You accomplish the mission. The difference is that the consequences of failure are usually measured in lives rather than dollars or bureaucratic efficiency." "Do you miss it? The field work, I mean." "Every day," Sarah replied without hesitation. "But that's not really the question you should be asking." "What should I be asking?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time that evening, it seemed completely genuine. "You should be asking what happens when someone like me tries to transition to a world where problems can't be solved with precision and patience from 1,000 yards away." Before Jay could respond, she was extending her hand for a farewell handshake. "It was nice meeting you, Lieutenant Commander Morrison. I have a feeling we'll cross paths again." As Jake watched her walk away, moving through the crowd with the same quiet confidence she displayed all evening, he realized that his assumptions about rank, age, and capability had been completely shattered. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that there were levels of service and sacrifice within the military that he'd never even imagined. The woman who had just walked away wasn't just a commander in the U.S. Navy. She was a ghost who could kill from distances that defied belief, a professional who had shaped world events with actions that would never appear in history books, and a warrior whose skills were so specialized that her very existence was a state secret. And he'd asked her about her rank, as if she were a junior officer trying to network her way up the ladder. Jake remained standing near the marble column for several minutes after Sarah's departure, processing everything he'd learned and everything he'd failed to understand. The reception continued around him, but he found himself watching the other officers with new eyes, wondering what other secrets and stories were hidden behind the familiar hierarchy of rank and ribbon. 3 weeks after the reception, Jake Morrison found himself staring at a classified briefing folder that would change everything he thought he knew about Commander Sarah Chen. The folder had arrived on his desk that morning with a priority classification that made his coffee grow cold as he read through the contents. Operation Neptune's I had been declassified for internal review, and Jake's security clearance had apparently been upgraded overnight to accommodate his new assignment. According to the cover letter, he was being tasked with conducting a comprehensive analysis of special operations effectiveness in the Pacific Theater over the past 5 years. The letter was signed by Admiral Thompson, the same officer he'd met at the reception. As Jake opened the folder and began reading, he quickly understood why his encounter with Commander Chun had taken on new significance. The operation files painted a picture of naval special warfare that was both more sophisticated and more deadly than anything he'd encountered in his intelligence career. Operation Neptune's I had been a 3-year counterterrorism initiative targeting high-value individuals who were coordinating attacks against U.S. naval assets throughout the Pacific. The operation had required unprecedented cooperation between intelligence services, special operations units, and diplomatic channels. At its center was a small team of naval snipers who had been tasked with eliminating threats that conventional military action couldn't address. The primary operator on the team was identified only by call sign, Artemis. Jake read through the mission reports with growing amazement and horror. Artemis had conducted 17 separate operations across 7 countries, eliminating targets that range from terrorist financiers to weapons dealers to corrupt government officials who were enabling attacks against American interests. Each mission had been planned with mathematical precision, executed with surgical accuracy, and completed without detection. The longest shot recorded in the files was 1,847 meters, over a mile, made from the deck of a fishing vessel onto a moving yacht in international waters. The target had been an arms dealer who was selling American military equipment to terrorist organizations, and his elimination had disrupted a supply network that was responsible for attacks against U.S. forces throughout the region. But it was the final mission in the file that made Jake's hands tremble as he read. The target had been Chun Wei, a Chinese military intelligence officer who had been coordinating cyber attacks against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The operation had required Artemis to infiltrate a diplomatic reception in Hong Kong, identify the target among hundreds of guests, and eliminate him with a single shot from a hotel room across the harbor. The mission brief noted that Chun Wei had been surrounded by bodyguards and that conventional assassination would have been impossible. Furthermore, his death needed to appear accidental to avoid diplomatic complications. Artemis had solved the problem by calculating wind patterns, security rotations, and the target's behavioral patterns over 3 weeks of surveillance. The shot had been made during a fireworks display celebrating Chinese New Year, using the noise and light to mask the muzzle flash and sound. Chun Wei had been standing on a balcony overlooking the harbor when a single bullet ended his life, fired from a distance of 1,200 meters through a gap between buildings that existed for less than 30 seconds as the target moved through his security detail. The report concluded with a simple notation: mission accomplished. Target eliminated. Operator extracted successfully. No diplomatic complications. But it was the addendum to the file that made Jake's blood run cold. A handwritten note in Admiral Thompson's own writing read, Artemis sustained significant psychological trauma during this operation due to personal connection with target. Recommend immediate reassignment to non-operational duties and mandatory psychological evaluation. Operator's identity to remain classified indefinitely. The personal connection wasn't detailed in the file, but Jake could guess. Chun Wei wasn't just a target. The name suggested a family relationship to Sarah Chun. The woman he'd met at the reception had been ordered to kill her own relative. Jake sat back in his chair, staring at the file and trying to process the implications. The confident, professional officer he'd encountered at the reception wasn't just a decorated sniper. She was a woman who had sacrificed everything, including family ties, for her country's security. The red dot at the center of her tattoo suddenly took on new meaning. His contemplation was interrupted by a knock on his office door. "Come in," he called, hastily closing the classified folder. To his surprise, Commander Chun herself entered his office, closing the door behind her and activating the security lock that indicated their conversation would be classified. "Hello, Jake," she said, taking a seat across from his desk without invitation. "I understand you've been reading about my work." Jake tried to maintain his professional composure, but the weight of what he'd just learned made it difficult to meet her eyes. "Commander, I was assigned to review Special Operations Effectiveness. I didn't realize that you'd be reading about me specifically." Sarah finished. "Admiral Thompson thought it might be educational for you to understand what you'd encountered at the reception." She leaned back in her chair, studying his expression. "How are you processing it?" "Honestly, I'm not sure I am processing it," Jake admitted. "The tactical aspects are impressive, obviously, but the personal cost." He gestured vaguely at the folder. "I can't imagine what that final mission must have been like." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed her hands, which had been relaxed, suddenly clenched into fists. "The final mission was successful," she said simply. "All objectives were accomplished." "But the target was your family," Jake said gently. "The report mentions a personal connection." For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Jake understand just how much pain could be hidden behind professional competence. "Chenwei was my cousin," she said. "We grew up together in San Francisco's Chinatown. His parents had immigrated in the 80s, mine in the 90s. We were practically siblings." She paused, staring at something beyond Jake's shoulder. "He was brilliant, studied computer science at Berkeley, spoke 5 languages, could have done anything with his life. What happened to him? Money initially, then ideology. The Chinese intelligence service recruited him while he was in graduate school, started small with information about his professor's research, then gradually escalated his involvement." Sarah's voice was clinical now, as if she were reading from a mission report. "By the time we identified him as a threat, he was coordinating cyber attacks that were killing American sailors." Jake waited for her to continue, sensing that she needed to tell this story in her own way. "The hardest part wasn't making the shot," Sarah continued. "The hardest part was the 3 weeks of surveillance. I watched him every day, learned his routines, his habits, his security protocols. And every night, I remembered the kid who used to help me with my math homework." "Did he know you were there?" Sarah shook her head. "He never suspected. On the night of the mission, he was standing on that balcony laughing at the fireworks, probably planning his next attack against our forces. He looked exactly like the boy I'd grown up with, except his actions were getting my shipmates killed." Jake realized he was holding his breath. The woman sitting across from him had lived through something that most people couldn't even imagine, much less survive psychologically. "The shot was perfect," Sarah said, and there was no pride in her voice, only a terrible emptiness. One moment he was alive, the next he wasn't. Clean, professional, mission accomplished. She met Jake's eyes for the first time since beginning her story. And that's when I understood that I couldn't do this job anymore. Because of the family connection, because I realized I'd become someone who could kill family and sleep that night, Sarah replied. The Navy had trained me to be a perfect weapon, and I was. But weapons don't make moral choices. They just accomplish objectives. She stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the naval base. I started wondering what else I might be willing to do if ordered, and I didn't like the answers I was finding. Jake struggled to find appropriate words. The psychological evaluation mentioned in the file, did it help? Sarah turned back to face him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked vulnerable. The Navy shrinks diagnosed me with moral injury, a type of psychological trauma that occurs when someone is forced to act against their deepest values. It's common among special operations personnel who've been in the field too long. Is it treatable? Theoretically, you learn coping mechanisms, develop strategies for processing guilt and conflicting loyalties. But the fundamental problem remains. I'm someone who was shaped into a killer, and now I have to figure out how to live in a world where problems can't be solved with a rifle. Jake began to understand the comment she'd made at the reception about transitioning to a world where precision and patience couldn't solve every problem. Is that why you're in a non-operational role now? Admiral Thompson pulled me from field duty immediately after the Hong Kong mission, Sarah confirmed. Officially, I'm assigned to Special Operations Training and Development. Unofficially, I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not behind scope. And what have you discovered so far? Sarah returned to her chair, and Jake noticed that some of the tension had left her shoulders. Talking about her experience seemed to be providing some relief, even if the underlying pain remained. I've discovered that transitioning from special operations to normal military life is harder than anyone wants to admit, she said. For 7 years, my identity was completely tied to my operational capabilities. I was Artemis, the invisible hand that eliminated threats before they could materialize. Now I'm just Commander Chun, and I'm not entirely sure what that means. Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite its darkness. The training role, is that helping? It's meaningful work, Sarah acknowledged. Training the next generation of snipers, developing new techniques and protocols. But it's also a constant reminder of what I used to be capable of. She paused. Do you know what the most difficult part of my current job is? Teaching others to do what you can no longer do. Teaching others to maintain their humanity while becoming lethal beyond imagination, Sarah corrected. Every student I work with is someone's son or daughter, someone who joined the military to serve their country. My job is to turn them into people who can end lives from distances that most people can't even see clearly, while somehow ensuring they don't lose themselves in the process. Jake realized he was getting a glimpse into a world that existed parallel to the conventional military he knew, but with stakes and consequences that were almost incomprehensible. How do you do that? Maintain humanity while teaching people to kill. You emphasize the mission, not the act, Sarah replied. You teach them that every target represents hundreds or thousands of lives that will be saved. You help them understand that their skills are a tool for protecting others, not a means of personal power. She was quiet for a moment. And you hope that they never have to face a situation like Hong Kong, where the mission and their personal values create an irreconcilable conflict. Do you regret it? The mission, I mean. Sarah considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my cousin chose the path that led to that balcony. I regret that the only way to protect American lives was to end his life. She met Jake's eyes steadily. But I don't regret taking the shot. He was responsible for deaths of people I'd sworn to protect, and he wasn't going to stop. Someone had to make the hard choice, and I was trained to be that someone. Jake found himself with a new understanding of what service and sacrifice actually meant. His own work and intelligence suddenly seemed almost trivial compared to the weight of responsibility that Sarah had carried. Can I ask you something personal? Jake said. You can ask. I may not answer. The tattoo was getting in the way of processing what you'd been through. Sarah touched her throat unconsciously, where the tattoo was hidden beneath her uniform collar. The tattoo serves multiple purposes. It's a record of my service, a warning to others about who I am, and a reminder to myself of what I'm capable of. She paused, but mostly it's a way of ensuring I never forget the cost of the choices I've made. The hash marks represent all 17 targets. They represent 17 lives that ended because of decisions I made and actions I took, Sarah corrected. Whether they were targets, enemies, or threats doesn't change the fundamental reality. 17 families lost someone because of me. Jake was beginning to understand that Sarah's transition from operational duties wasn't just about psychological trauma. It was about learning to carry a moral weight that most people would find crushing. How do you live with that knowledge? Some days better than others, Sarah admitted. I have regular sessions with a therapist who specializes in moral injury. I volunteer at a Veterans Crisis Center on weekends. I try to find ways to use my experience to help others rather than just dwelling on the past. She stood up, indicating that their conversation was nearing its end. And I remind myself that the alternative to taking those shots would have been allowing much greater suffering to occur. Is that enough? The rational justification? Sarah moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face him. Jake, let me tell you something that isn't in any file or training manual. When you've spent years making life and death decisions in seconds, with incomplete information and under extreme pressure, you learn that moral certainty is a luxury that warriors can't afford. She paused. The question isn't whether my actions were right or wrong. The question is whether I can live with the consequences of my choices while still being someone worth saving. As she reached for the door handle, Jake called after her. Commander, why did you tell me all this? I mean, beyond Admiral Thompson's educational objectives. Sarah turned the handle, but didn't open the door immediately. Because you asked honest questions at the reception, and you seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. She paused, and because I'm trying to learn how to talk about my experiences with people who haven't lived them. You're good practice. Practice for what? For figuring out how to be human again, Sarah replied simply. After she left, Jake sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at the classified folder that had revealed so much about the woman behind the uniform. He was beginning to understand that his encounter at the reception hadn't been a chance meeting. It had been an introduction to a world where service meant sacrificing not just comfort and safety, but fundamental pieces of one's identity and moral certainty. Commander Sarah Chun wasn't just a decorated sniper who had transitioned to training duties. She was a woman who had given up everything, including the ability to live with easy moral certainty to protect others. And now she was trying to figure out how to rebuild a life from the fragments of what remained after years of impossible choices. The red dot in her tattoo suddenly made complete sense. It didn't just represent a particular mission. It represented the moment when duty and family loyalty had collided so violently that only one could survive. And Sarah Chun had chosen duty, knowing it would cost her a piece of her soul that she might never recover. 6 months after their first meeting, Jake Morrison found himself standing in the observation gallery of the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, watching Commander Sarah Chun work with a class of prospective snipers. The transformation in her demeanor was remarkable. Where the woman at the reception had seemed guarded and isolated, the instructor below was engaged, passionate, and completely in her element. Jake had been assigned to observe the training program as part of his broader analysis of special operations effectiveness. But his real interest was in understanding how Sarah had managed to channel her experiences into something constructive. The psychological reports he'd read suggested that most operators with her background struggled significantly with the transition to non-operational roles, yet she seemed to have found a way to make it work. The most important thing to understand, Sarah was saying to her students, is that precision shooting isn't about the rifle, the scope, or even the bullet. It's about becoming a system, a biological machine capable of processing dozens of variables simultaneously and producing a predictable outcome under extreme stress. The students were arranged in a semicircle around a training rifle mounted on a precision rest. Each of them wore the focused expression of someone trying to absorb information that might someday save their life or the lives of their teammates. Jake could see Sarah's influence in their posture. They held themselves with the same alert confidence he'd noticed in her. Who can tell me the primary factors that affect long-range accuracy? Sarah asked. A young petty officer raised his hand. Wind speed and direction, range to target, temperature, humidity, and atmosphere pressure. Good start, Sarah nodded. What else? Elevation changes, target movement, rifle cant, and shooter stability, added another student. Better. Keep going. The students continued listing factors until they'd covered nearly 20 variables that could affect a long-range shot. Sarah wrote each one on a whiteboard, creating a complex web of interconnected considerations. Excellent, she said when they'd exhausted their list. Now, here's the question that separates snipers from marksmen. How long do you have to process all these variables when a target appears unexpectedly? The students looked uncertain. Finally, one raised his hand tentatively. 30 seconds. Sarah shook her head. Try again. 15 seconds. In a perfect world, maybe In reality, you typically have between 2 and 5 seconds from target identification to trigger pull. Everything on this list needs to be processed, calculated, and compensated for in less time than it takes to order coffee. Jake watched the students' faces as the implications sank in. What Sarah was describing wasn't just difficult, it was humanly impossible unless the shooter had trained to a level that transcended normal human limitations. This is why we train, Sarah continued, not to become better at shooting targets, but to become people who can make impossible calculations under impossible pressure and still deliver precise results. She moved to the rifle, adjusting its position slightly. Your brain needs to become a ballistic computer that operates faster than conscious thought. One of the students, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22, raised her hand. "Commander, how do you train your brain to work that fast? I mean, some of these calculations are really complex." Sarah's expression softened, and Jake could see her shifting into what he'd come to recognize as her teaching mode, where her natural intensity was tempered by genuine concern for her students' development. "That's the right question, Petty Officer Williams," Sarah said. "You don't train your conscious mind to work faster. You train your unconscious mind to take over." She picked up the rifle, settling into a firing position with fluid ease. "Watch my movements. Notice that I'm not thinking about each adjustment. My body is making dozens of micro-corrections automatically." Sarah demonstrated a firing sequence, and Jake could see what she meant. Her actions flowed together seamlessly, as if she were dancing rather than preparing to shoot. There was no hesitation, no conscious decision-making visible in her movements. "This is what we call unconscious competence," Sarah explained, setting the rifle aside. "After enough training, your body knows what to do without your mind having to issue specific instructions. But getting to that level requires more than just practice. It requires rewiring your nervous system." Another student raised his hand. "How long does that take?" "For basic competence, about 18 months of intensive training. For operational effectiveness, 3 to 5 years, depending on natural aptitude and training frequency." Sarah paused, and Jake could see her weighing how much of her personal experience to share. For the kind of unconscious mastery that allows you to make shots that other people consider impossible, that's a lifetime commitment. Jake noticed that Sarah's students hung on every word she spoke, and their attention wasn't just professional, it was personal. They clearly respected her not just as an instructor, but as someone who had walked the path they were trying to follow. "Commander," said Petty Officer Williams, "can you tell us about the hardest shot you ever made?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her considering how to answer. He knew from their previous conversation that her experiences were largely classified, but he also understood her desire to give her students something real to connect with. "I can tell you about the principles involved," Sarah said finally. "I once had to make a shot at extreme range under conditions where traditional ballistics calculations were inadequate. The target was moving, the weather was changing rapidly, and the window of opportunity was less than 10 seconds. The students leaned forward, clearly captivated. The shot required me to ignore everything I'd been taught about systematic calculation and instead trust my unconscious processing of the situation. I had to feel the wind patterns rather than measure them, estimate the target's movement based on psychological rather than mathematical predictions, and take the shot based on what my nervous system was telling me rather than what my brain was calculating." "Did you make it?" one of the students asked. "Yes," Sarah replied simply. "But that's not the important part of the story." "What is the important part?" Sarah moved to the whiteboard and drew a simple diagram, a shooter, a target, and a line between them. "The important part is understanding that every shot you take as a sniper carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate target." She added additional figures to the diagram: families, communities, political leaders. This shot prevented an attack that would have killed dozens of people, but it also ended a life, devastated a family, and changed the political balance in an entire region. Jake watched the students absorb this information, and He could see them beginning to understand that sniper training wasn't just about technical skills. It was about preparing for the psychological and moral weight of their actions. This is why your training doesn't stop with marksmanship, Sarah continued. You also need to develop the psychological resilience to make life and death decisions repeatedly without losing your humanity. She set down her marker and faced the class directly. Some of you will never fire a shot in combat, and you should consider yourselves fortunate. Others will face situations that will test everything you believe about right and wrong. My job is to prepare you for both possibilities. During the break, Jake made his way down to the training floor. Sarah was cleaning the demonstration rifle with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. "Impressive class," Jake said as he approached. "They really look up to you." Sarah glanced up from her work. "They're good kids. Smart, dedicated, willing to push themselves harder than most people can imagine." She paused in her cleaning. "I just hope I'm teaching them the right things." "What do you mean?" Sarah set down the rifle and faced him. "I'm teaching them to become people capable of extraordinary violence in service of their country. But I'm not sure I'm adequately preparing them for what that does to a person over time." Jake had been thinking about this question since reading Sarah's files. What would adequate preparation look like? "Honestly, I don't know if it's possible." Sarah moved to a window overlooking the training ranges. "You can teach someone to handle the technical aspects of long-range shooting. You can even teach them to manage stress and fear. But how do you prepare someone for the moment when they realize they've become fundamentally different from everyone they grew up with?" "Is that what happened to you?" Sarah nodded. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped being the person who joined the Navy to serve her country and became someone whose entire identity was built around my ability to kill precisely and efficiently." She paused. "The technical term is moral injury, but that doesn't really capture the experience." "What does the experience feel like?" "Like watching yourself from outside your body," Sarah replied. "Like being a passenger in your own life while someone else, someone harder and more capable, makes all the important decisions." She turned back to face him. "Do you know what the most frightening thing about my time in special operations was?" Jake shook his head. "It wasn't the missions, the danger, or even the killing. It was how natural it became. By the end, I could eliminate a target and go to dinner afterward without thinking about it. I'd become exactly what the Navy needed me to be, a person without normal human emotional responses to violence." Jake was beginning to understand the full scope of what Sarah was trying to accomplish with her students. She wasn't just teaching them to shoot. She was trying to find a way to maintain their humanity while giving them the skills they needed to survive. "How do you prevent that from happening to them?" "I try to keep them connected to who they were before they started this training," Sarah explained. "I encourage them to maintain relationships with people outside the military, to pursue interests that have nothing to do with weapons or combat, to remember that their identity extends beyond their professional capabilities." "Does it work?" "Sometimes, but the fundamental problem remains. To be effective in special operations, you have to become someone willing to do things that normal people can't even imagine. And once you cross that line, it's very difficult to find your way back." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Sarah's students. As the afternoon session began, Jake watched Sarah shift back into instructor mode, but now he could see the additional layer of complexity in what she was trying to accomplish. She wasn't just teaching technical skills. She was trying to solve an impossible puzzle: how to create warriors capable of extraordinary violence while somehow protecting their essential humanity. It was a problem that the military had been grappling with for generations, and Sarah was approaching it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. "Today we're going to work on psychological preparation," Sarah announced to the class. "Who can tell me what happens to your body when you're under extreme stress?" The students listed the physiological responses they'd learned: increased heart rate, tunnel vision, loss of fine motor control, changes in hearing, and time perception. "Good," Sarah nodded. "Now, how do these changes affect your ability to make precise shots?" "They make everything harder," one student replied. "Your hands shake, your vision narrows, you can't think clearly." "Exactly. So how do we overcome these limitations?" Training under stress, suggested another student. Breeding technique. Mental conditioning. Sarah wrote each suggestion on the board. All correct and all insufficient by themselves. The real solution is to train your nervous system to operate effectively while your conscious mind is compromised. She picked up the rifle again. Watch this demonstration. Sarah had one of the students use a timer to create artificial stress, calling out random commands and time limits while she prepared for a shot. Throughout the exercise, her movements remained smooth and controlled, even as the student created increasing pressure. Notice that my technique doesn't change regardless of external stress, Sarah explained after completing the demonstration. This isn't because I'm naturally calm under pressure. It's because I've trained my body to respond automatically to the task requirements, independent of my emotional state. Jake could see the students absorbing not just the technical lesson, but the deeper implication that becoming an effective sniper required rewiring fundamental aspects of human psychology. As the class continued, Sarah introduced increasingly complex scenarios that required her students to make rapid decisions while processing multiple types of information. Jake realized he was watching a form of education unlike anything in civilian life. Training designed to create people capable of superhuman performance under conditions that would incapacitate most individuals. But he could also see Sarah's constant effort to keep her students grounded in their humanity. Between technical exercises, she would ask them about their families, their goals, their hopes for the future. She was trying to maintain their connection to the world they were training to protect, even as she taught them to become capable of extraordinary violence. During the final exercise of the day, one of the students, Petty Officer Williams, struggled with a particularly challenging scenario that required making a shot while processing rapidly changing information about civilian positions and potential collateral damage. "I can't do it, Commander," Williams said, stepping back from the rifle. "There are too many variables, and I can't guarantee civilian safety." Sarah approached the student with the same calm intensity Jake had observed at the reception. "Tell me what you're seeing. The target is clear, but there are civilians moving through the background. If I miss by even a few inches, or if the wind shifts, I could hit someone innocent. So what's your decision?" "I can't take the shot. The risk is too high." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Excellent decision, Williams. This is exactly the kind of thinking that separates snipers from mere marksmen." She addressed the entire class. "The most important shot you'll ever make is the one you don't take, because it's not the right shot." Jake found himself impressed by Sarah's teaching philosophy. She was creating soldiers who understood that their ultimate responsibility wasn't to their weapons or their targets, but to the innocent people they'd sworn to protect. As the class ended and the students filed out, Sarah began methodically cleaning and securing the training equipment. Jake approached her one final time. "I have to ask," he said, "do you think you're succeeding? In keeping them human, I mean." Sarah looked up from her work, considering the question seriously. "I think I'm giving them the best chance they'll ever have," she replied. "Whether they succeed or fail will depend on choices they make years from now, under circumstances I can't predict or control." "But you're trying." "I'm trying," Sarah confirmed. "Because the alternative is creating more people like the person I became, technically perfect but fundamentally disconnected from the world they're supposed to be protecting." As Jake walked back to his office, he realized that Sarah Chun was fighting a different kind of war now. Not against enemy targets, but against the dehumanizing effects of the very training that made special operations effective. She was trying to solve a problem that had no clear solution: how to create warriors without destroying the people those warriors used to be. And in her own quiet way, she was succeeding. Her students weren't just learning to shoot. They were learning to remain human while acquiring superhuman capabilities. It was a lesson that only someone who had lost and reclaimed their own humanity could teach. 2 years after their first meeting, Jake Morrison received an emergency call that would bring him face-to-face with the true cost of Sarah Chen's past. The call came at 3 in the morning, pulling him from sleep with the urgent tone reserved for genuine crises. "Jake, this is Admiral Thompson. I need you at Bethesda Naval Hospital immediately. Commander Chun has been involved in an incident. and we need someone who understands her background to help assess the situation. Jake dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities as he drove through the empty Washington streets. Sarah had seemed to be thriving in her training role. Her students consistently ranked among the top performers in the Navy sniper program, and her psychological evaluations had shown steady improvement over the past 18 months. The hospital psychiatric wing was unfamiliar territory for Jake, but Admiral Thompson was waiting in the lobby to escort him through the security protocols. The Admiral's expression was grim, suggesting that whatever had happened was serious enough to threaten Sarah's career and possibly her freedom. What happened? Jake asked as they walked through sterile corridors toward the secure ward. 3 days ago, Commander Chun was shopping at a farmer's market in downtown Norfolk when she identified a man she recognized from her operational days, Admiral Thompson explained. The man was Chun Wei's brother, her cousin's younger sibling, who had apparently immigrated to the United States 6 months ago under a student visa. Jake felt a chill of understanding. She saw family she didn't know was in the country. It gets worse, the Admiral continued. According to witnesses, she followed him for several blocks, maintaining surveillance patterns consistent with her operational training. When he entered a coffee shop, she positioned herself across the street and observed him for nearly 3 hours. They paused outside a heavy door marked with security warnings. Through the reinforced glass, Jake could see Sarah sitting on a hospital bed, staring at something beyond the window. She looked smaller than he remembered, as if the weight of whatever she'd experienced had physically diminished her. The police were called when other customers noticed her behavior and recognized it as potential surveillance, Admiral Thompson continued. By the time they arrived, she was in a full dissociative episode, unable to respond to questions, completely unaware of her surroundings, apparently reliving some kind of operational scenario. Is she dangerous? Not to others, but she's been cycling between periods of normal awareness and episodes where she believes she's still on operational status. The Admiral's voice carried a weight of personal concern. The doctors think seeing her cousin's brother triggered something like a flashback, but one that's lasting days instead of minutes. Jake looked through the window at the woman who had taught him so much about service and sacrifice. In her hospital gown, without her uniform and bearing, she looked vulnerable in a way that seemed fundamentally wrong. What do you need from me? The doctors want to understand her operational history to better treat her current condition. Most of her files are classified beyond their clearance level, but you've read everything and you've spent time with her personally. Admiral Thompson paused. They also think having someone she trusts might help bring her back to present awareness. Jake nodded and followed the Admiral into the room. Sarah looked up as they entered, and for a moment her eyes seemed to focus with their usual intensity. Then, confusion clouded her expression. "Jake," she said uncertainly, "are you my handler for this mission? I wasn't expecting support personnel." The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Sarah wasn't seeing him as her colleague or friend. She was seeing him through the lens of whatever operational memory was playing in her mind. "Sarah, you're not on a mission," Jake said gently. "You're in a hospital in Norfolk. It's been 2 years since your last operation." Sarah's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, fear, something that might have been relief. Then the clarity faded again, and she was back in whatever scenario her mind had created. "The target has been eliminated," she said in the flat, professional tone Jake had never heard her use. "Extraction protocols are in effect. When do we move to the secondary position?" Admiral Thompson gestured for Jake to follow him back into the hallway, where a Navy psychiatrist was waiting with a thick file. "Commander Chun has been cycling through what appear to be memories of her final operation," the psychiatrist, Dr. Martinez, explained. "The triggering event, seeing her cousin's brother, seems to have created a complete breakdown in her ability to distinguish between past and present. Is this common in special operations personnel?" Jake asked. "More common than we'd like to admit," Dr. Martinez replied. "What makes Commander Chen's case unusual is the duration and intensity of the episodes. Most PTSD flashbacks last minutes or hours. She's been experiencing continuous episodes for 3 days. Jake studied Sarah through the window, watching as she moved around the room with the same tactical awareness he'd observed during her training sessions. Even in her confused state, she was unconsciously assessing angles, cover positions, and potential threats. What's the prognosis? Uncertain. We've seen similar cases where patients recovered completely within weeks, and others where the dissociative episodes became permanent. Dr. Martinez closed the file. The key factor seems to be whether we can help her process the original trauma that's been reactivated. The Hong Kong mission, Jake said. Exactly. The guilt and conflict from that operation were never fully resolved, just managed through therapy and medication. Seeing her cousin's brother apparently brought all of that psychological damage back to the surface. Admiral Thompson placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. We need to know if you're willing to help. The doctors think someone she trusts, someone who knows her story, might be able to guide her back to present awareness. Jake looked at Sarah, remembering their conversations about moral injury and the cost of service. He realized that everything she'd shared with him had been leading to this moment. Not just her story, but her trust in him to understand it. What I need to do. Dr. Martinez outlined the approach. Jake would spend time with Sarah, engaging her in conversation while gradually introducing elements of present reality. The goal wasn't to argue with her perceptions, but to slowly expand her awareness to include information that contradicted her operational mindset. The most important thing to remember is that she's not choosing to be confused, Dr. Martinez emphasized. Her brain is trying to protect her from psychological pain by retreating into familiar operational patterns. We need to make the present feel safer than the past she's hiding in. Jake entered the room alone, approaching Sarah with the same careful attention to body language and positioning that she'd taught her students. She looked up as he sat in a chair across from her bed. Status report, she said automatically. The mission is complete, Jake replied, following the doctor's guidance to work within her current perceptions rather than against them. All objectives accomplished. We're in the debriefing phase now. Sarah's posture relaxed slightly. Casualty count. Jake realized she was asking about her targets, and the weight of what she'd lived through hit him anew. 1 Kia, enemy forces. No friendly casualties. Collateral damage? None reported. Sarah nodded, and Jake could see some of the tension leaving her shoulders. In her mind, she was receiving confirmation that her final mission had been successful and clean, the best possible outcome for a sniper operation. Commander Chun, Jake said carefully, can you tell me about the target? Sarah's expression became guarded. That information is classified. I have clearance. This is part of the debrief. For several minutes, Sarah described the Hong Kong operation in detail, but from the perspective of someone still living it. She talked about wind patterns, security rotations, and sight lines as if she were still planning the shot. But gradually, Jake noticed she began including details that suggested awareness of the operation's consequences. The target was a high-value individual with family connections to operational personnel, she said, her voice becoming less mechanical. Mission planners noted potential for psychological complications due to personal factors. What kind of personal factors? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone beginning to remember pain they'd been hiding from. The target was blood family to the operator, she whispered. Mission requirements created an irreconcilable conflict between duty and personal loyalty. Jake leaned forward, sensing that Sarah was beginning to surface from whatever psychological shelter she'd been hiding in. What happened to the operator after the mission? The operator completed all assigned tasks successfully, Sarah replied, but her voice was breaking. Mission objectives were accomplished without complications or diplomatic incidents. She looked directly at Jake for the first time since he'd entered the room. The operator was severely psychologically damaged and required immediate reassignment to non-operational duties. Sarah, Jake said gently, you were the operator. The mission was 2 years ago. You're safe now. For a moment, Sarah's face went completely blank. Then, tears began flowing down her cheeks as the full weight of her situation crashed back into her awareness. "Jake?" she said, and this time her voice was completely present. "What am I doing here? What happened to me?" Jake spent the next hour helping Sarah piece together the events that had led to her hospitalization. She remembered seeing Chun Wei's brother, remembered following him, but everything after that was a blur of confusion and fear. "I thought I was back in Hong Kong," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I could smell the harbor, hear the fireworks. I was convinced I was still planning the shot." She looked at her hands, which were shaking slightly. "How long was I gone?" 3 days, Jake replied. "But you're back now. Am I? Or am I going to lose myself again the next time something reminds me of that night?" Jake didn't have an answer for that question, and he realized that Sarah's journey was far from over. The successful transition he'd observed, her effective teaching, her apparent psychological recovery, had been more fragile than anyone had understood. Dr. Martinez joined them for the remainder of the session, and Sarah worked with both men to develop strategies for recognizing and managing future episodes. The conversation was clinical and practical, but Jake could see the fear in Sarah's eyes as she contemplated a future where her own mind might betray her without warning. "The good news is that you came back," Dr. Martinez explained. "Many patients with prolonged dissociative episodes don't recover this quickly or completely. The fact that you were able to respond to Mr. Morrison suggests that your connections to present reality are still strong." "But it could happen again," Sarah said. "It could. But now we know what to watch for, and you have people who understand your situation and can help guide you through it." Over the following weeks, Jake visited Sarah regularly as she worked through an intensive therapy program designed specifically for special operations personnel with moral injury. He watched her struggle with questions that had no easy answers. How do you reconcile love of country with the personal cost of service? How do you live with decisions that were both necessary and devastating? How do you maintain relationships when your experiences are fundamentally incomprehensible to most people? The breakthrough came during a session where Sarah was working with a new therapist who specialized in treating veterans with classified operational histories. Jake was present as an observer, watching Sarah describe her experiences without the emotional distance she'd maintained in their previous conversations. "The hardest part isn't the guilt," Sarah said. "The hardest part is the isolation. I can't talk to my family about what I've been through because it's classified. I can't talk to civilian friends because they wouldn't understand. Even other military personnel don't really get it unless they've been in special operations themselves." "What about your students?" the therapist asked. "Do you feel connected to them?" "Yes and no," Sarah replied. "I care about them, and I think I'm helping them prepare for what they'll face. But I'm also acutely aware that I'm teaching them to become people like me, people who will struggle with these same issues in 10 or 15 years. Do you regret that?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret that it's necessary. I regret that the world is a place where people need to be trained to do what I've done. But I don't regret trying to prepare them as well as possible for the psychological realities of the job." Jake realized that Sarah's teaching wasn't just about preserving her students' humanity. It was about finding meaning in her own experiences. By helping others navigate the path she'd walked, she was creating something positive from her pain. "Commander Chun," the therapist said, "I want to try something different. Instead of focusing on what you've lost or what you regret, tell me about what you've gained from your experiences." Sarah was quiet for several minutes. Then, she began to speak in a voice that carried more strength than Jake had heard from her in weeks. "I've gained an understanding of what people are capable of when everything they care about is at stake," she said. "I've learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're properly trained and motivated. I've discovered that there are forms of courage that most people never have to develop, and forms of sacrifice that most people never have to make." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've also learned that healing is possible, even from the worst psychological injuries. That meaning can be found in the darkest experiences. That connection with others, even if it's limited and careful, can provide enough light to navigate through almost anything. Jake felt something shift in the room as Sarah spoke. For the first time since her hospitalization, she sounded like the competent, insightful officer he'd come to respect. Most importantly, Sarah continued, I've learned that my value as a person isn't determined by my operational capabilities. I spent years thinking I was only worthwhile because I could do things other people couldn't do. Now I'm beginning to understand that my real value lies in what I can teach others, how I can help them avoid some of the mistakes I made, and how I can use my experiences to make the world a little bit safer for people who will never know my name. As Sarah was discharged from the hospital and returned to her training duties, Jake realized that her breakdown had actually been a breakthrough in disguise. She confronted the worst of her psychological trauma and emerged with a clearer sense of purpose and identity. Her teaching methods evolved to include more emphasis on psychological preparation and post-operational support. She developed new protocols for helping special operations personnel process moral injury before it became debilitating. Most importantly, she began speaking openly about her own experiences, providing her students with a model for how to survive and thrive despite the psychological costs of their service. 6 months later, Jake attended a graduation ceremony for Sarah's latest class of sniper students. As he watched her present awards to young men and women who had completed one of the military's most demanding training programs, he reflected on everything he'd learned about service, sacrifice, and resilience. Commander Sarah Chin wasn't just a decorated sniper who had transitioned to training duties. She was a warrior who had faced the ultimate cost of service, the loss of her own sense of identity and humanity, and had found a way to reclaim both while helping others avoid the same fate. Her tattoo no longer represented just her operational history. It represented her journey from brokenness to healing, from isolation to connection, from despair to purpose. The red dot at the center of her crosshairs tattoo had evolved in meaning. It still represented the mission that had cost her so much, but now it also represented the moment she'd chosen to use her pain as a foundation for helping others. In the end, that choice had proven to be the most important shot she'd ever taken, not at a target, but at redemption itself. And unlike every other shot in her career, this one had saved a life instead of ending one. Her own. 5 years after that fateful encounter at the Naval Reception, Jake Morrison stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College, preparing to deliver a lecture that would forever change how the military understood the human cost of special operations. In the front row sat Commander Sarah Chun, now a respected expert in operational psychology and the architect of revolutionary new approaches to preparing warriors for the psychological realities of their service. The auditorium was filled with senior officers, military psychologists, and policymakers who had come to hear Jake present his comprehensive analysis of special operations effectiveness and psychological sustainability. But the real star of the presentation was the woman whose journey had inspired all. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake began, what I'm about to share with you represents 5 years of research into a question that the military has been reluctant to ask. What is the true cost of creating the most elite warriors in human history? And how can we minimize that cost while maintaining operational effectiveness? The presentation began with statistics that made the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Suicide rates among special operations personnel were significantly higher than the general military population. Divorce rates exceeded 70%. Substance abuse, depression, and anxiety disorders were endemic. Most troubling of all, the most elite operators, those with the highest operational success rates, showed the highest rates of psychological breakdown after leaving active service. The conventional wisdom has been that these problems are an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of the high-stress nature of special operations, Jake continued. Today, I want to challenge that assumption and present a different model, one based on the experiences of an operator who not only survived the worst psychological trauma our profession can inflict, but transformed that trauma into a foundation for helping others. Jake clicked to a slide that showed Sarah's official Navy photograph alongside a simple caption. Commander Sarah Chun, Naval Special Warfare, call sign, Artemis. A murmur went through the audience. Sarah's reputation had grown significantly over the past few years, but many in the audience had never connected her current work with her operational history. Commander Chen's story illustrates both the problem and the solution, Jake said. Her operational record was flawless, 17 successful missions over 7 years, with tactical innovations that have become standard practice throughout the special operations community. By every conventional measure, she was the perfect special operator. Jake clicked through slides showing redacted mission summaries, tactical analysis, and performance evaluations. The data painted a picture of exceptional competence and dedication. But perfection came with a price that wasn't reflected in any performance evaluation or commendation. Jake continued. By the end of her operational career, Commander Chun had developed what psychologists call moral injury, psychological trauma resulting from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate fundamental moral beliefs. The next slide showed a timeline of Sarah's psychological evaluations, charting a steady decline in emotional well-being that corresponded directly with her operational success. The more effective she became as a sniper, the more psychologically damaged she became as a person. The breaking point came during her final mission, when operational requirements forced her to eliminate a target who was also a blood relative, Jake said. The mission was successful by every military measure, but it left Commander Chun psychologically shattered and unable to continue operational duties. Jake paused, looking at Sarah in the front row. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to continue with the most personal aspects of her story. What happened next challenges everything we think we know about recovery from severe psychological trauma, Jake said. Instead of medical retirement or long-term disability, Commander Chin chose to remain in service and find a way to transform her experiences into something constructive. She didn't just recover. She revolutionized how we prepare operators for the psychological realities of their service. The presentation shifted to Sarah's innovations in sniper training, showing how she had integrated psychological preparation with tactical instruction. Her students consistently showed lower rates of post-mission psychological distress, while maintaining the same high levels of operational effectiveness. Commander Chin's approach is based on a simple but revolutionary principle, Jake explained. Instead of treating psychological trauma as an unfortunate side effect of necessary operations, she treats psychological preparation as an essential component of tactical training. Jake showed video footage of Sarah working with her students, demonstrating how she wove discussions of moral complexity and psychological resilience into every aspect of their education. Her classes didn't just produce better shooters, they produced more psychologically resilient warriors. The results speak for themselves, Jake said, displaying comparative statistics. Students trained under Commander Chen's protocols show 50% lower rates of post-operational psychological distress, 30% better long-term career satisfaction, and significantly higher retention rates in special operations roles. Admiral Thompson, now commander of Naval Special Warfare, stood up from the audience. Mr. Morrison, these results are impressive, but how do we know that Commander Chen's approach doesn't compromise operational effectiveness? Some would argue that psychological preparation could make operators hesitant or second-guess critical decisions. It was the question Jake had been expecting, and Sarah had helped him prepare for it. That's the most remarkable aspect of her results, Admiral, Jake replied. Students trained under her protocols actually show improved operational performance in complex scenarios requiring split-second moral judgments. When operators understand the psychological implications of their actions in advance, they make better decisions under pressure, not worse ones. Jake clicked to a slide showing mission success rates and decision-making assessments for Sarah's graduates compared to traditionally trained snipers. The data was compelling. Operators who had received psychological preparation along with tactical training performed better in every measurable category. The explanation is straightforward, Jake continued. When operators are psychologically prepared for the moral complexity of their missions, they spend less mental energy managing internal conflict and more energy focused on tactical execution. They're not distracted by guilt, confusion, or moral uncertainty because they've already processed those challenges during training. A Navy psychologist in the audience raised her hand. What about selection criteria? Are we looking at operators who are naturally more resilient, or can these techniques be applied broadly? Sarah stood up to answer this question herself. Dr. Williams, that